Hello and thanks for joining me. It's kind of a dreary, rainy day here where I am, kind of a cool day for this time of year, and I've just sort of been staying in all day. I did wrap up listening to my most recent audiobook, and I thought it was really a good time to pause and do another update on what I've been listening to over about the last month and a half since I did my last audiobook update. So in my previous video about listening to audiobooks, I mentioned that I was only listening to books that I have previously read, and I've sort of kept that up. So all these books that I'm going to mention, I've previously read in the past, sometimes in the very distant past, but for audiobooks, I find that the times that I find to listen to books, I am doing some other activity like driving or knitting or like chores like folding clothes and things like that. So to me, it's worked better so far to just re-engage with works on a sort of an audio level that I've actually read in the past. So let's just jump into it. So I'll go in the order that I read them since my last update. So following my last update, the first one that I listened to was Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. I also want to mention I've gotten all of these audiobooks from my library, and there is an app called Libby, I think it is. Libby. Here's the app right there, Libby. And if I open that, I can see, well, it doesn't want to open, but I can see, and here in Maryland, we have Maryland Digital E-Library Consortium, and I can borrow books from that using my library card from my local library. But okay, back to the books. All right, so Our Mutual Friend. Let me just get back to that cover. There is the cover. This was originally published in 1865. It's by Charles Dickens, and this particular audiobook was read by Simon Vance. I read Our Mutual Friend the last time I read this was probably 20 years ago. I went through a phase of reading all of Charles Dickens' works, which I made it through, I think, all but one, but I've reread some of them over the years. This is not one that I've reread, so this was the first time that I'd re-engaged with it again since reading it way back when. I just loved this so much. This Simon Vance, who read this, is a voice actor, so voiced all the characters. And if you've ever read any Charles Dickens, you know that that's kind of what he's known for, these just sparkling characters. Victorian 19th century London just comes to life. It just booms to life, really, with these characters. And the plot of this is very, there's a mystery. There's assumed names and people who aren't exactly what they seem, but it mainly concerns a miserly, wealthy man who made his fortune in the dust business, and he dies. And he leaves his fortune to his son, who is abroad, as long as his son returns to London and marries this person who he's never met, named Bella. And if he doesn't do that, then the fortune goes to Mr. and Mrs. Boffin. So Mr. and Mrs. Boffin are these kind of kind-hearted people who wind up sort of simple people who wind up inheriting this fortune through a series of events. Another main character we have is Lizzie Hexam, the virtuous and beautiful Lizzie Hexam, the daughter of a riverman who makes his living by fishing out dead bodies out of the Thames and robbing them of their change in their pockets. And anyway, there's a connection there. So in the end, all of these characters are connected. Lizzie eventually goes to live with Miss Jenny Wren, who is I think she's like a dwarf person, a small person, little person, and she's a doll dressmaker. Just a wonderful character, Miss Jenny Wren. It's worth it to read this book or to listen to this book just to get a little taste of Jenny Wren, because she's just such a fantastic, no-nonsense character. let's see, who else was I going to mention? Oh, the Lamleys. The Lamleys are a couple. They each marry each other because they think the other one is wealthy, and then when they get married, they find out that neither one of them had any money, and so they go to scheming to make money. But I could go on and on about this book. I don't want to go on about it too much, but it's one of those books it was just a delight to listen to. It is, it's quite hefty. I think it was, oh gosh, 30 hours of listening. It took me a while to get through this, but well worth it. So, yeah, Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens was the first book I read since my last update. So then I moved on to Cold Mountain. So I know if you've watched my channel, you guys know I love this novel, Cold Mountain. I've read the novel itself 3 times, the most recent time only last December. So you may think, is Ernest Lieston really so much into Cold Mountain that he can read it in December and then listen to it in July? Yes, he is. Yes, he can. So, yeah, I probably actually listened to this more like late June. This was actually read by the author, Charles Fraser. This is a Civil War era novel. I've talked about it several times. It was a different experience, to listen to it as opposed to reading it, and especially to hear it read by the author. Now, he did not voice the characters. He just read it like it was someone reading to you. But he did a great job reading it, and I never get tired of this story. Civil War era, Civil War soldier in North Carolina decides to walk away from the Civil War when he's in a hospital, a Confederate hospital, and start a long walk home to Western North Carolina to Cold Mountain, where there is also a character named Ada whose father has passed away. She's kind of a pampered urban person, and she's struggling to make a new life for herself in the new conditions under which she finds herself in the Civil War. And other characters in here, Ruby, it's just a great, beautiful story to me, and I loved it. And I love listening to it again. And I would listen to it again. And then I listened to... I decided to give Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse a listen. This was read by James Langton, who did a really good job of reading this, because Siddhartha, this comes across, it really sounded like an ancient work. I kind of got that vibe too when I read the book. I read this last year, so I did a chat on this, and I will link to it below. I also chatted Cold Mountain. I will link to that chat below, but I chatted this. And so this concerns a young, wealthy, privileged young man named Siddhartha and his friend Govinda, they're both wealthy, privileged people. They leave their life of a privileged life to go and become ascetics and renounce all pleasure and this type of thing. They do this for a few years. They're on a spiritual journey. Ultimately, they meet the Buddha. Govinda then decides to follow the Buddha. Siddhartha does not want to follow any religion or any dogma, and so he goes back and actually engages with the world again, and then meets up eventually in his later years with an enlightened ferryman by a river, and that's where his journey sort of culminates. So I loved listening to this. It didn't take very long, but it really sounded like, I was listening to some kind of ancient work, the way that the book is structured, and the way that it was read. It just really sounds really ancient, even though it was published originally in 1922. So it's a 20th century work. All right. So then I decided to I've never listened to this before, but The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. It's been many, 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 many years since I read this. I know I read it in high school for a book report, and then I read it again, I think, right after college. That's been several decades ago. So it's been a long time since I've read it, but listening to it was a treat. It was read by Alexander Scorby. So this concerns, the Daisy Buchanan and Tom Buchanan, and then Jay Gatsby, who loves Daisy and has loved her forever. And then it's narrated by a person named Nick, who sort of narrates the action for us. It's really all about, it gets pegged as this jazz age 1920s thing, and yeah, it takes place in the 1920s on Long Island, in New York, in and around New York City. But to me, it's just really about affluence and how affluent people can have it all and still be so very empty. And to me, that's kind of what what we were dealing with here. Jay Gatsby, kind of a surprise. I didn't remember him being quite the tragic figure. I found him quite tragic in listening to this, more so than when I had read it before. Now I would like to see the recent film that was done of this, the film adaptation of this that came out a couple of years ago, which I've never seen. So I need to see the film of this. So I'll be doing that sooner or later. All right, then finally, before I run out of time, I just wrapped up today listening to Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow. This is a work of nonfiction by Yuval Noah Harari. This was originally published in 2015 in Israel. It was published in the UK in 2016 and didn't make it over to the US until 2017. I read this last year, also chatted this, so I'll link to that below. I love this sort of a history of Homo sapiens, our species, as well as sort of trends of where we're headed and off into where our species may be headed into the future. And it's just a wealth of, thought-provoking information, and I really enjoyed listening to this again, re-engaging with this. When I read this last year, I really devoured it. I read it really fast, and so it was really kind of good to give it a listen, and go slower, a little bit slower, I think, through the material again. So yeah, that wraps up my update. What I have on tap next. My hold just got released at the library, so I will be listening to Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. I've been looking forward to this so much. It's got 166 narrators. So lots of people join forces to read this book, to tell this book verbally, and I'm really looking forward to this because I did enjoy the book very much. I read this last year, so Lincoln in the Bardo will kick me off in my next segment. I'll read... I'll listen to several works, and then I'll have another update in another month and a half to 2 months or something like that. So until next time, take care. Bye.